Hello, I'm Glenn Carl. Welcome to everyone from around the world. I am a partner with Fair Observer, a former national
Fair Observer
intelligence
Intelligence.
Fair Observer Intelligence.
A senior
former
partner at Fair Observer Intelligence.
Former national intelligence officer in the American intelligence community, the author of The Interrogator, and now a geopolitical analyst for magazines and in general. And I'm with Atul Singh, who is the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. In the next hour, as we do each month, both of us, the Rajput and the Wasp, you can work out which one is which, will make sense of the three most important developments of the month as we see them, and we'll try to make sense of the world. I think this month we have three larger than usual topics, in fact, as we are all at what appear to Atul and me some historical inflection points that are not just emerging but are in process. So we'll talk about three subjects: debt, inflation, and interest rates. That's one. Where's the global economy headed, basically? And then what I, with an attempt at wit, have started to call Germany, tanks, snow, and an inflection point, which is really about how the Russia-Ukraine war is going, but with unusual off the battlefield developments of consequence. And then the third is Beijing being the middle kingdom in the center of the world progressively, or once again, China's growing struggles, something we talked about a number of times from different angles. But this time, from the perspective of Japan's strategic response, which I think is quite important, and how or whether this shows that the balance of power in Asia, at least the international dynamics there, are changing. And so since these are unanswerable questions, I'll turn the first one over to Atul, who will take a stab at providing the answers. Well, what's going on, Atul, with debt, inflation, interest rates, in the world economy?
Oh dear. So let's get the facts out first, and they are slightly alarming. So what do we know? The IMF tells us, the International Monetary Fund, which is terrible when it comes to prescribing policies, but it is decent when it comes to publishing reports. And it tells us that debt has reached a record $235 trillion. It is now 247% of the GDP. So global debt is $235 trillion. I'll repeat, it is 247% of the global GDP. Now that is, shall we say, slightly alarming. Eurozone inflation has reached 9.2% in December 2022. It fell from over 10% in November. So that's a good thing in a way, but remember, prices are rising, and they are rising at much higher than the European Central Bank's target inflation rate of 2%, which the world has been used to since 1991. So that is, of course, a worry. Because of inflation, there is a food and debt crisis in the poorest countries. Why? Because if you have to pay more for the basics and you earn less for what you sell, then what happens is your debt goes up, and the cost of servicing your debt goes up because interest rates are going up. So it's a double whammy. So one, because you have inflation, because your currency is falling, you're paying more, because food is not coming in from, let's say, Russia and Ukraine. Now you have to buy from the open free market. Now you're paying more. Your own exports have gone down because other economies, such as, let's say, Germany or Belgium, if they were importing cocoa, don't import cocoa as much. So your earnings have gone down. So that means you're spending more, earning less, your debt is going up. And when your debt is going up, you also have to pay more the cost of servicing the debt, which is interest. Any of you who've had a mortgage know about interest payments. That has gone up. So at a country level, this has created enormous political strain. Look, Italy, Hungary, and Sweden are just reflections of that phenomenon. The reason you have right parties of the far right, or more to the right, howsoever you define it, in charge, and you had centrist people voted out, is because of that strain. There are countries that are going with a begging bowl to the International Monetary Fund. Sri Lanka is in chaos. Even its defense is being slashed. Pakistan doesn't have electricity. Our very dear friend, Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed, a fantastic scholar on Pakistan who's written the best books on Pakistan, sent me an email saying there was no electricity, talking about how the country had gone to the dogs. So Pakistan is back to the IMF with a begging bowl a 17th time, or maybe an 18th time. Doesn't matter. The point is its economy has been flushed down the toilet. It's now going to Russia for cheap oil. Bangladesh has gone to the IMF. Argentina has gone to the IMF. I could go on, but you get the picture. There is a massive balance of payments crisis ricocheting through emerging economies or the developing world or the global south, the third world, whatever term you want to use. Now, more importantly, however, is the fact that German industry is reeling. Germany has been the powerhouse, the beating heart of the European economy. Germany drives the EU. And there was a headline which caught my attention, which said Mittelstand to Mittel-kaput. And in fact, Deutsche Bank economist Stefan Schneider said, when we look back at the current energy crisis in 10 years or so, we might consider this time as the starting point for an accelerated deindustrialization in Germany. In a sign of what may be coming, chemical giant BASF, which began 157 years ago, has announced that it will be permanently downsizing its operations in Europe to escape high energy costs. There are businesses that are paying 8 times more than their current bill for the price of raw materials to run their businesses. So my view of the global economy is that we will see a global recession, most likely. Of course, I'm no astrologer. We may avoid it through some miracle, but I think the reason we'll see it is not because of the pinprick of the Russia-Ukraine war, although it's not a pinprick per se. I mean it metaphorically, because the pinprick of the Russia-Ukraine war burst a balloon that was waiting to burst. For a long time, I have spoken against quantitative easing. For me, it is the equivalent of silver that came from the New World when the Portuguese and Spanish discovered silver. And of course, a third of it flowed out to China. And that expansion in money supply led to the collapse both of the Iberian economies and of the Ming Dynasty in China. So I think quantitative easing was always going to end badly. It had led to an asset market bubble, which is starting to burst now. Also, it was amplified by the bailouts of 2007, 2008, when the financial crisis occurred, and then by the pandemic deficit spending or massive fiscal stimulus. So combine that, lots of money printed by central banks, plus lots of spending by various governments, and you get this massive debt bubble, not just in poorer countries, but in the most advanced economies of the world. And then you have asset market bubbles. And so this balloon has now all been burst by the Russia-Ukraine war. And so I, obviously coming from the old world, being a Rajput with 800 years of defeat behind me, take a pessimistic view. I will hand it over to the WASP, who will obviously have a more optimistic view of the great sunlit uplands.
Well, it's true. I grew up in the generation where the assumption was, and those of you who are Americans and older than 35, I think maybe 40 will identify with this. The assumption was that America would solve any problem presented. There was no problem that didn't lead to a better future, and that we simply had to put our minds to it. I mean,
Yeah, you put your minds to Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan with splendid results.
The larger picture is the meta trends that have been globally dramatically positives for 70 years. So that's the difference in perspective. With lowering mortality, infant mortality, lengthening lives, increasing, rising income worldwide, and so on and so forth. But any number of disasters occur along the way. I'm being only slightly facetious because the halcyon view of how everything can be resolved is simply not reality, of course. But I think on the whole, Atul, you and I share the same view, but we look at different facets of what we're looking at a little bit. I think the main reality and dramatically alarming developments that you touched upon fundamentally are for the less developed, the poorer countries, which make up most of the world still. So whereas an American, or I would even say a German, will worry about an increased cost of eggs, in much of the world, there is no food. The statistic that you didn't note, but that underscores the points you made, is that the United Nations assesses that there are at present 49 million people who are days away in the world, days away from starvation, from dying, from lack of food, and that there are now 350 million people in the world who are in an acute, what they characterize an acute nutrition crisis, meaning that they are starving, but they aren't going to die tomorrow. A point we made before in an earlier talk, as I recall, you touched upon in general a moment ago, Atul, is that the war in Ukraine has disrupted global food supplies. Ukraine produces 10% of the world's wheat, as I recall. That alone, which most of which now is not reaching the global markets, is enough to destabilize hundreds of millions, if not literally billions of people who live on the brink of having enough caloric intake to survive. But more dramatic than that is that 10% accounts for upwards of 50%, I think, of the caloric intake in a number of countries in the Middle East, which have so many problems that we could fill the entire hour talking about them. So those countries, Jordan, Syria, elsewhere in the Middle East, are far more powerfully affected by the war in Ukraine with regard to nutrition, which not only, but that should be enough, risks starvation for hundreds of millions, but risks political, economic disruption and collapse. I've mentioned before that a climatic problems in Syria 15 years ago related to the effects of global warming was probably the fundamental cause of the Syrian collapse and civil war, more important than the American invasion, which also was of Iraq, which was also very destabilizing. So the point on the food and debt crisis, food crisis, is I'm just reinforcing it. These are real problems which are hard to see for Americans. For Americans, inflation consists of the price of gas on the whole, and they will moan and bring down a government if the cost of gasoline rises too high. But that, of course, is an inconsequential problem compared to literally matters of life and more probably death as a result of the war. So these things are real. It's also true, however.
Just if I may add, the food crisis is triggered not just by the fuel crisis, but a fertilizer crisis as well. So it's It's the 3F crisis in a way: food, fertilizers, fuel, and they're all linked together because the cost of fuel is a key determinant of the price of food. And that's why in India, there was a Global South Summit. And some of you who are dialing in from India know that India leads the G20 this year. And there was a Global South Summit on this very matter in January, precisely at a time when the global elite was cavorting in Davos.
Mhm. Davos. I've never been invited, which I suppose is a good thing.
I was this year. I didn't go. I was invited, and for some reason, I thought that I had better things to do, such as doing this with you.
It would have been memorable, I'm sure. So, but as perspectives, I'd like to talk just for a second about Albrecht Dürer and then Italian Renaissance artists. Both of them were looking at the same and trying to portray the same moments in Christian theology, except Dürer and the Germans have always tended to focus on the pain, suffering, end point, as in death, of Christ's crucifixion, whereas the Italians tend to portray it as the apotheosis of hope and leading to.
And we can see how well the two economies have fared as a result.
We can see the same reality portrayed in dramatically different ways. So while all the facts are the same, and it's true, Germany is struggling. Germany has always sort of lamented that things are wrong. They do tend to see the empty part of the economic glass more than I think the reality would be, since they remain a prosperous society. Which gets to the point, the counterpoint, I guess I'd say, that I was making, would like to make, while not disagreeing with really anything that you were saying. Just as it still is true that as the American economy goes, so goes the world, but with a 18-month or 2-year lag. And the polling, the assessments of economists about the trends in the American economy have been improving. 6 months ago, a strong majority of them anticipated a recession for all the reasons you touched upon in the US and then globally. Now it's less than half of them do, meaning that they are more hopeful, if not optimistic, that the measures of the Fed largely, but also the successes of industry or the economy writ large in addressing supply chain blockages due to the pandemic largely, are proving quite successful, and that these blockages have been resolved, easing pressures on prices. Inflation is coming down. Inflation has been, I'll be off by a few point, but the relative positions would be correct. The inflation in the US has been something like 7.5% this past year, Europe 9.2 or so, and for the world 11 something, which shows why Americans are more sanguine, perhaps optimistic. But everywhere inflation is dropping pretty rapidly. Yes.
Glenn, I just got back from the American Economic Association annual conference at New Orleans, where I went with Nasir Khilji, who was at the US Treasury. He's just retired. And you're absolutely bang on the money that when it comes to the US, economists are more optimistic. That includes even gloomier economists. But if I may point out, America has the advantage of cheap gas. America also has the advantage of a lot of new technologies, such as smart manufacturing, additive manufacturing. So you can not just use 3D printing, but also you can use liquid and solidify it with laser and all the sorts of high-tech stuff, the merging of software and hardware, the smart manufacturing.
So we have all sorts of advantages.
And you have the best universities in the world, and you have very close integration between universities and business. And also you have a well-developed angel investing and venture capital industry, which may be full of many charlatans, but it still provides a tremendous bang to the American economic engine. Europe, on the other hand, does not have that. And European gas prices have risen through the roof. And so this war might be very good for the US, but may not be good for the rest of the world. And the fact that what's good for America may not apply in this case, it may not, what's good for America is good for the world may not apply in this case. In fact, what's good for America may be terrible for the world, and American industry might emerge triumphant on the corpses of its European competitors.
As has usually been the case when there are major wars, because America has two oceans protecting it. No, I don't disagree. I think the only difference is that the trends are less with respect to inflation and international global recession are improving and less harmful, less negative than we had all assessed 6 months ago. I'm not saying that that all of the problems you touched upon and that I tried to add to in the description are not matters of life and death for hundreds of millions of people. Just that the things are less bleak, and the recession may actually be avoided for the United States, conceivably for Europe, unlikely, and that the trends are improving. Something that is a political issue in the U.S., and I won't take too much longer because we have to move on to other things I know. There's been a renewed focus on the debt and how debt will lead to inflation, will lead to employment and lower GDP growth, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of this is nonsense, frankly. When you look at it's motivated by the Republican Party. It's true that the absolute debt number is the largest that it's been, I think, in history. However, as you mentioned in your comments, the debt to GDP ratio in the United States has been progressively declining. It is lower now than it has been for I should know the figure, it slips my mind, but it's certainly for a decade, and since I think the crisis of 2008, which shows truly the fundamental strength of the economy. Now, as I say, even in the best case, my favorite disaster economy that I always talk about is Burundi, because I live there. All of these trends will be weakened and only take effect a couple of years down the road. So this is all not good. However, there is one fundamental positive development which seems progressively likely to emerge from all of this disaster, which originated with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and that is the energy transformation of Europe and the world in particular, away from fossil fuels. Now, at present, for the year 2023, so far there has been good fortune in a mild winter, and so the demand for energy, specifically gas, has been softer than feared. But there's no especially increased alternative supply at present. But the alternative supplies, which largely means solar and wind power and liquefied natural gas coming from the United States, will start to come online in Europe and in the United States in significant to a significant degree, an amount that will affect the economies of Europe and the United States, starting about the end of 2023, in particular with offshore wind and solar power in the United States and also in Europe. So I think that whereas I agree with most points, I think the trends have been better than the catastrophe that we all feared, and things are bad, but it will be so with regard to debt, inflation, interest rates, the economy, and matters of life and death for hundreds of millions, but are improving and less catastrophic.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.